We have heard commentators get famous with a few cliches and lines of their own. There's Nasir Hussain's line for Pakistan. Pakistan cricket at its very best, 1 minute down, next minute up. Then there's Ravi Shastri, who has his whole cliches as well. But rarely would you come across someone who's become famous because of one tweet of his. I have someone who's also known as the guy who keeps tweeting. That's why you pick your best keeper. I have Ben Jones of CricViz with me for this episode of Gupshup with Gill. Thank you, Ben, for taking out the time, and I hope all's well with you and your family. And I hope you're looking forward to this show as much as I did.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you for having me. It's yeah, that was a very good introduction. I feel very put upon. It's we've got a fantastic summer of cricket in England coming up, and India coming over for the World Test Championship final, and then the Test series against England. Given everything that's happened in the last 18 months, and obviously I know that India is still in a terrible situation in terms of the pandemic and stuff. Cricket's been something of a bit of a salve to the wound for a lot of people, and hopefully over the next 6 months we can just kind of get back to enjoying the cricket as for what it is, rather than having to be a distraction alone. But yeah, hopefully that's where we're at. But yeah, I hope all's well with you and yours as well.
Yeah, all's good over here, and quite considerate of you to mention that hopefully things get back to normal. That it's not just a distraction anymore, but what it is. It's supposed to be. Anyway, I want to ask you that how did you come up with this line? That's why you play your best keeper. Just take us through this. Was it instinctive, or was it something that you thought, and then came up with it?
I feel like we're giving it far too much credit. It's not that interesting. The obvious kind of kickstart for it was the conversations about whether or not India were going to include Wriddhiman Sahar or Rishabh Pant as their test keeper. Obviously, that's been going on for the last 3 years or so since Pant made his debut in England. And the commentary, which always seemed to come up, was the idea that Sahar would come in and take a nice catch off the spinners, take a nice outside edge off Ashwin, and then suddenly everyone's on Twitter saying, that's why you must pick your best keeper. That's why. And you get the opportunity to praise your choice. And for people who really back the idea of having specialist keepers, that makes it's a bit of vindication. And so it was very much just a kind of sarcastic way of tweeting it whenever anyone did anything, because it's such a meaningless phrase. No one deliberately picks a bad wicketkeeper. No one deliberately picks a guy that can't take catches. Pant, ahead of the 1920 series against Australia just gone, I think he had one of the best catch success percentages in the world. And he was, but according to our numbers, he was a relatively kind of below average, but not spectacular keeper. And so whenever he took anything resembling a right catch, it was just quite nice to just sarcastically throw in and say, that's why, implying thus that he was the specialist keeper, not Sahar. It got very old very quickly. And I certainly grew tired of having to say it. But it's one of those things, you get a catchphrase, you've got to lead into it. So for at least a test, it was, it filled my timeline and my notifications. But hopefully we're going to move on to slightly more interesting comments from mine over the last few years. Because if that's the peak of my career, I'm in trouble. I probably need to come up with something about it.
Yeah, that pretty much is. One thing which people tend to forget or don't know is that Rishabh Pant made the record for most dismissals in the IPL back in 2019. I think, if I'm not wrong, he had 25 dismissals and broke Kumar Sangakkara's record of 22 or 23. And in that season, I think he also had 100% catch percentage. Hardly dropped anything. So he's never the bad keeper that everyone thought he was, and it's good to see that he's improved. I think the way he kept in the India-England series at home, I think it was just brilliant to see.
Well, I think one of the reasons why I kind of engaged with the debate quite, even if it was just sarcastically and tongue in cheek, I was quite seriously very interested in it. In terms of it's the classic debate, isn't it, between a specialist wicketkeeper, a specialist gloveman, and a keeper batsman. That's not a modern phenomenon, specific to these players. And we've looked at it in England in the last few years with Joss Buttler versus Ben Foakes and Johnny Bairstow. We've had it with Jack Russell and Alex Stewart, and numerous people down the years, Ian Healy, Adam Gilchrist. And I was speaking to Adam Gilchrist about it when I was doing some work with Fox last season, and he kind of chimed in with what I thought was a very appropriate commentary. Is basically just, as long as whoever you pick is good at the role that you pick them for, then you're not going to have a huge amount of problems. So if you pick a specialist gloveman like Sahar, who's a brilliant keeper, then you're golden. And if you pick a guy who's a batsman who can also keep wicket, like Rishabh, then you're also golden because he's very good. He can average 40 plus with the bat. So I think it became a bit of a false argument, and I think it often kind of it becomes very, very kind of tribal and unnecessarily kind of aggressive between like the old style keepers and the modern style keeper batsman. You know, at the end of the day, if the player performs their role and they fit into the 11 and they allow other players to be picked, they allow, you know, to, if you have an extra keeper batsman, then you can maybe focus more, as India have done in the last few years, on having a bowling attack that is just the 4 best bowlers. You don't need to worry about the fact that Bumrah can't bat if you've got a keeper who can. So I think it's kind of, you've always got to consider it in the round and kind of a kind of holistic approach. You can't just say, well, I always pick this kind of player. I'm a guy who picks a keeper batsman. You know, you've got to look at the players you have to hand, I think.
So you make a good point that, you know, and I think what people forget is that Rishabh Pant's predecessor, who was MS Dhoni, he also wasn't the best keeper at the time in the circuit when he made his debut. There were a lot of criticism over his keeping technique as well. But as we saw over the years, he became one of the very good keepers and, you know, was perhaps the best keeper that we had seen, you know, keeping to spin. So do you feel that sometimes, you know, people just read too much into technique and not too much into the results?
Yeah, I think the issue with technique and discussing it more generally is that, you know, it is something that a very small group of people know an awful lot about. And sometimes that's a bit of a dangerous concoction. And we kind of, as a result, give people too much kind of deference and we don't challenge them enough. But I do think wicket-keeping particularly is such a specific skill set that actually there is a very, very small number of people in the world who know what they're talking about when it comes to keeping technique. And so when players do come through and those critics say, you know, this guy can't keep wicket effectively with his current technique, I can understand. I think you do have to kind of defer to them and say, yeah, you know what, you know more about this than me and the rest of us watching the press pack. What I would say is that there's so many examples, like you say, Dhoni is just one of players who've improved their technique, who've adapted it, spoken to different people, and technique is fluid, it's not fixed. You've got this opportunity to grow and improve it, to adapt, to make radical changes or tweaks. You've always got the opportunity to change the way you play the game and to, as a result, get very different results. And yeah, Matt Pryor is a classic one. You know, could have got into the England top 6 on his batting alone, but his keeping was really poor when he first came into the side. But after, you know, 3-4 years of working, he was as good as it gets. And by the time he retired, he was a world-class wicketkeeper. And I think that should be testament enough. There are, you know, every country's got an example of, you know, a player who's come in and improved. And, you know, it's a skill which clearly is maybe a bit of a lifelong vocation, that actually you get better the more you do it and the more you kind of get opportunity to kind of be exposed to top level coaches. I think, you know, as I say, always when asked this kind of question, like, I'm terrible at cricket in every regard. I'm awful. I can't bat, bowl, field or keep, but I know certain things about the game, and there's certain things that I know absolutely nothing about. And in terms of technique, I'll happily defer to almost anyone who's played the game, because they do know what they're talking about, unless I can directly challenge it with numbers, or someone else who equally knows what they're talking about can form a counter argument, then it's clearly a bit more up for debate. But I do think that, yeah, technique is something that we should be a little bit careful of rowing in on and kind of offering our 2 pennies worth, because, you know, from the outside, there's a lot of things we can do, but that might be one thing we can't.
You know, I had a smile on my face when you said that you probably not, really can't play the sport. I think a lot of us who are in this field, you know, who talk about the sport on Twitter or on other platforms or with our friends and family, etc. I think a lot of us only talk about it and, you know, try and break down, because if we were good enough to play it, we would have been playing it and not discussing it. So I think
Absolutely.
that's a mutual feeling, and I think a lot of people would share it. Anyway, moving on, I want to ask you one thing. Would you say that you're the unsaid ambassador of the Rishabh Pant fan club?
Yeah, I mean, seemingly I've had it hoisted on me. My colleague Freddie Wild at CricViz would probably argue that he is a bigger fan, but is just quieter about it, which is probably quite indicative of a lot of things in terms of, you know, better but quieter. It's funny because, yeah, I do love him, and I know that I have a bit of a reputation for being a big fan, but I feel like I've got reasonable grounds for why I love him, and you know, it's kind of twofold. That, like, from a professional point of view, all of, you know, I feel like we spent the last 4 years saying all of the numbers say this guy is a genius, or he's, you know, at the very least going to be world class. He's got everything, you know, all of his underlying numbers are superb. he's already producing it in terms of actual on the scorecard business in the IPL. He's made a test ton on his first series in Test cricket in England. He's then gone away and done it in Australia. It's like, why do I feel like I'm fighting a losing battle in terms of as a professional person at CricViz telling people this guy's great? And yes, there seems to be this constant narrative that he was a slogger, or that he couldn't keep wicket, or that he wasn't fit enough. I'm like, well, you know, he can be as unfit as he likes if he keeps making tons. I couldn't care less. And you kind of, I consistently came up against it, and you know, in different ways. Some people were just being playful and just saying, yeah, I don't rate him. And some people genuinely, seemingly quite vindictively didn't think he could succeed, and thought that his success, as I saw it, was a, you know, symptom of something worse and bad in Indian cricket. And so his, you know, the vindication of seeing him hit the runs at the Gabba and lead the block out at Sydney and stuff, I couldn't have been happier. From a personal perspective, I did feel like we were vindicated, and that is nice. But also, just as a cricket fan, like, the lad whacks it. He just, you know, he's an exciting young kid. He scored more runs than almost any player ever in T20 cricket at this age. He hits the ball while sitting on his backside. He barely has one hand on the bat at the best of times. And yet every time he swings it, it seems to go for six. I don't understand why people wouldn't love this. It's just, I do think there's maybe a slight cultural thing in, like, certain cricketing cultures maybe are more accepting of kind of genuine, kind of unorthodox. And Indian cricket has obviously had so many absurdly brilliant technicians in the last 20 years. The icons of the game are technicians. Whereas other cultures and other forms of the game are built on unorthodoxy a bit more. And I think there is an element to which those two things are rubbing up against each other. And that's partly why there's so much kind of pushback against Rishabh and the way he plays. But like I say, I mean, from a professional point of view, brilliant that he's succeeded. And from a personal point of view, I'm just glad that he's finally getting picked for everything, because it means I get to watch him more, because he's the best.
You made a few good points. One was obviously about maybe the culture is such that he's not very accepting, that the country and the cricketing culture is not very accepting of unorthodox players, and the other was that you're probably too loud about it. So it brings me to two questions. One is obviously since you are so loud about your admiration for Rishabh Pant, I've seen, when he doesn't do well, people sort of start asking you questions, and sometimes, it can get really nasty. I feel that, the comments become very personal, where people sort of sometimes, need to draw that line. So, how do you deal with it, especially the hate comments? Because it's something that, everyone gets it, whether, it be someone like you who's now a relatively known voice in cricket, and even someone who has just even 100 followers on Twitter. Even if that person has something which is an extreme point of view, or is probably not very acceptable point of view, hate is something which gets received very often. So how do you deal with it, considering because you're also new to the platform, and you've already spoken of, I think, on a couple of occasions, how the hate comments can get to you. So what do you feel about the whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, on a fundamental level, I don't have it that bad at all, and I don't want people to think that I'm going on about it. I'm a straight white bloke, from England. I don't really have that much. People don't sling the horrible stuff that they could sling at me, that they do sling at others. I've got colleagues and people who work in the game who get far worse, far more regularly for far less. So first things first. But it does kind of kick you a little bit, because it's one thing if someone just kind of send you a kind of slightly snide message when, one of your players who you've backed, slogs one up in the air, or, gets pelted around the ground. That's one thing. And you kind of, rough with the smooth. That's the game, isn't it? We all talk whether we're talking with our friends, and, we've all got opinions that get disproved and proved. And the fact that I essentially have these views professionally, it's fair enough that they're under a greater microscope than other people's. And so I kind of welcome it in that sense. But yeah, the kind of the personal side of things and the personal attacks are a bit, I personally just find it a bit strange that, this is, game of bat and ball at the end of the day. And there are certain things going on in the world that we should probably pay a bit more attention to than, the degree of intensity that we discuss cricket in is maybe a bit silly, particularly in the current climate. But yeah, personally, I don't find it, I don't find it too upsetting most of the time, but occasionally you get something which just catches you out and it just kind of knocks you for six, and then you have to have a bit of a break. And I've recently just had a couple 3 or 4 weeks just not looking at it, not tweeting. And it's great because you forget all the bad stuff and you start thinking, oh, I want to go back on Twitter because I want to talk about the good stuff. I want to post my articles. I want to express my opinions. And I'm lucky enough that, professionally, I don't need to be on Twitter to express my cricket opinions. I write my columns and write my pieces and speak to players, speak to coaches or whatever. It's not my only outlet, but it's an outlet that I really enjoy. And so I do think that it's a shame that there's a small portion of vocal minority that do just kind of seem to be intent on shouting down and just a general level of just unpleasantness. I just think it's very strange that most of the time these people they're 12 with a little Marvel thing in their profile picture, and it's at Kohli is great 124, or at Joe Root is the best, and it's it's a bit they're just kids messing around. That you can't take it too seriously, even if when you get 35 of them at once on one day you can feel a bit of an avalanche. But it's not it's much for muchness. Like I say,
I think in your particular case, it could also be, people who are, fans of David Milan, and probably whenever he does well, he'll also,
But exactly, and that's the thing, is that the thing which I always come back to is that I'm not, Twitter is a medium of communication for me. It's not my career. I'm not a kind of professional Twitterer. I'm a writer. I'm an analyst. I work with broadcasters. That is my job. And so my opinions aren't based on little personal vendettas or personal agendas or just kind of what's the contrary opinion. They're based on numbers and analytics. So I always, to an extent, feel, even if I'm, proved wrong numerously, I've always got the kind of comfort blanket of saying, well, you know what? I had that opinion about that player because I spent time constructing it and analysing it and working it through. And if I'm then proved wrong, fine, absolutely fine, because that happens far more often than it should. But that's the nature of talking in public about something which is as volatile as sport. So I don't really have a problem with that. I do just think, come on, lads, if you like a player, enjoy the player doing well, or if you don't like a player, enjoy that player doing badly on the sly. But it's a bit much to kind of constantly have a go at people who have different opinions for very little reason. It's just a bit silly. No more than that, but it is silly.
In this respect, I've found someone like Sanjay Manjrekar quite open about getting things wrong. He was quite he was quite convinced about Hardik Pandya not being able to bat at number 6 for India just before the Australia season. When he did well, he acknowledged that he probably got that wrong. So I think when that happens, also people need to be quite accepting of it. The other thing, where I feel sort of people need to understand this, that you can't have opinions on hindsight, because everything is going to look better in hindsight. It's a beautiful gift, no one has it. So if you're criticizing an opinion based on the game, especially where there are so many factors involved, I just feel that it cannot be on the basis of hindsight. It has to be before something has happened.
So since working in the game particularly, I've really come to admire as a trait in coaches and journalists and broadcasters and commentators, the ability to acknowledge when they have got stuff wrong, when they have made an incorrect call about a player, be it good or bad, pumping someone's tires up and then they turn out to be rubbish, or vice versa. I think being able to come out and and take the hit and say, I was wrong, I did get that wrong, I misjudged it, whether or not I placed too much effort, too much trust in my own judgment or in someone else's judgment who they know, or they placed too much emphasis on an innings where they were at the ground or something like that, or even just a kind of sixth sense about a player. Or in my case, if I've placed too much emphasis on the numbers and I've not taken into account other factors that are important still, I think it is really impressive when people can come out and acknowledge they are wrong, because I think it just adds to your credibility, because it gives you a kind of breadth of credibility as well. You're not just shouting about when you're right, which is easy. We can all do that. But being able to kind of just gently pipe up when you've got it wrong, I think is a really valuable trait for all people in the game, like players as well. It's a human trait that I think places everyone in good stead.
Yeah, it basically says that anyone can get something wrong and they're willing to improve upon it. One thing that you mentioned about probably that a lot of criticism that comes Pant's ways, or used to, if it doesn't come right now, is that because he was unconventional. And this is something that I've felt before as well. Like if when Virat Kohli came onto the scene, there was just too much talk about his tattoos, everything, his hairstyle, everything which was off the field stuff. Same, I think Hardik Pandya also, faced a similar kind of scrutiny. So I can say that, with some sense of, with some sense of history, that yes, in the subcontinent, probably how players look and carry themselves also has a bearing on how much of criticism or praise that they're going to get for their on-field exploits. Do you think it's the same when it comes to the cricketing culture in England, or it's different? It's completely different. People don't take into account how you are on field and then sort of decide about it.
No, they obviously it's very similar in many ways. I think that's, again, I think that's a human thing. I don't think that's a cricket thing. In terms of, if you rock up and you're 21 years old and you've got a load of tattoos and you're out partying all the time, people are going to infer certain things. I think that from a technical point of view, I think English cricket is a little bit more accepting of unorthodoxy, maybe because some of our great players have been a little bit more unorthodox, in terms of whether it's both them swinging from the hip or, Alistair Cook over the last few years, kind of never playing a cover drive and all of that kind of stuff. I think there's markers throughout English cricketing history who are a lot more unconventional. Not that Indian cricket doesn't have those, but I think that kind of golden period in the late 90s through to the early 2000s, these were all basically technically correct, very elegant players. I think in terms of culturally, I think English cricket has a bit of a double-edged thing in terms of, the obvious parallel with Hardik Pandya is probably Ben Stokes in terms of, all action, all format, all rounder, pace bowling, bowls like lightning, tattoos up the arms, hits a ball a long way. That kind of all action figure, I think maybe we're a little bit more, enthralled to that image in England because we've had Flintoff and we've had Botham and, in relatively recent times. That archetype of a player who is mouthy and but likes a drink and is a little bit of a renegade. I think English cricket has seen the successes of that so often in the last 25, 30, 40 years that maybe they're a little bit more forgiving. But it's all very broad generalizations at the end of the day. But I just think in Pant's case, at this very particular moment in time, I thought there was when I wrote something about him back during the last IPL, I thought there was, I felt like that was at the cusp of a very, very particular conversation around guys like Shubman Gill, who were very orthodox and very conventional, versus someone like Pant, who's only 2 years older or 2 or 3 years older, and has accomplished so much, but accomplished it in the wrong way, seemingly. I think that's probably what I'm getting at, rather than a kind of broader cultural examination.
I see. Moving on, we've discussed about Pant, which a lot of people, wanted me to ask you about. Now I want to know about your journey. How did you venture into this field of cricket analytics, the whole data thing, starting up numbers? Tell us a little bit about your journey and how did you end up doing what you're doing right now?
Well, I've always loved cricket. Always been a huge cricket fan. From when I was a kid, the kind of first I vaguely remember the 2003 World Cup, and that was probably just about when I first started to get into the game. I think, a lot of people of our age, the 2005 Ashes was, a monumental time in my kind of young life as a cricket fan. And I was 10 years old. This is, potentially the best series ever happening kind of in front of my eyes, and I very much fell in love with the game that summer, and it's continued for the rest of my life so far. But I always wanted to write about the game. During that summer, I kept a scrapbook of I'd cut out pictures from the paper and write out my own little match reports, which were either, basically just nicking what was on the, BBC Sport website or on the Telegraph or, in the Guardian or whatever, and then just kind of putting in my own little comments and writing out the scorecard. And I did that every day for that summer. And, thankfully I stopped doing that, because you probably shouldn't be doing that as a teenager, but when you're 10, it's quite cute. But I always liked writing about the game. And I produced like a little newsletter when I was at school for like lots of English projects and stuff, and I did that for a couple of years, where I basically just wrote about sport and sold it for like 20p. He was like this arrogant kid just selling this like sheet of A4 paper that he's printed off on his dad's computer for, trying to make a couple of quid. but I always liked writing about it. And as I say, I did play a lot, and I was all right as a kid. I was a leg spinner, and I was relatively good, but certainly nothing special. And then I just kind of moved away from it with studies and stuff. But I always carried on writing. Through university, I did an English degree, and I spent a lot of that time, writing blogs about cricket, around 2015, that kind of time. And I was always very engaged with that side of the game. And so when I left university, I wanted to be a cricket journalist. That side of things, not mathematical at all. Like I said, I've got an English degree, a literature degree, so I wasn't in any way armed to do mathematical stuff. And I did some work experience at what used to be called All Out Cricket magazine in London, where I met Phil Oliver, who is the head honcho at CricViz at the time and still is. And he basically said, this is good, but do you want to do this? Do you want to try doing something a bit different with CricViz? And I started working during the 2017 Women's World Cup, which was in England. I was doing kind of stato work in the commentary box, quite like traditional statistical scoring, the old-fashioned stuff, but getting to mix with commentators. And I met people there that I've worked with now for 4 or 5 years, and made it really exciting relationships that at the time I was just kind of in awe of, sat next to Ian Bishop, trying to feed him little nuggets to mention on commentary. It's like this, just living the dream. And then I've been working with CricViz since, and we've changed a lot as a company, and we've kind of gone from being a fairly small operation of doing little specific things with our app and pottering around on Twitter, but now we work with teams around the world. We work with three or four broadcasters. There's still a core team of us, but I've kind of fallen into it in terms of the numbers side of things, but I've always wanted to work in cricket. And so, it's absolutely living the dream. I always want to be more kind of, it's good. It has its bad days. It has its good days, but they're mainly good days. I love it. It's like that. It's pretty much as good as it gets. So.
You mentioned about making that scrapbook and everything, and I have a confession to make that I also used to do it when I was in school.
I think we all did.
Holidays, homework, I used to do that. And I also started to watch the game from the 2003 World Cup, and unfortunately, the love affair with the game started with the heartbreak because India lost so badly in the finals. But but your journey is something which really is very inspirational to anyone who wants to work in the field of cricket. I don't know many people who would have been 21, 22, and would have had the pleasure of working in a tournament like the Women's World Cup, and then have likes of Ian Bishop around. I would have developed cold feet. I'm being quite honest. Like, seeing Ian Bishop, I wouldn't have been able to find words out of my mouth. I would have been like, okay.
It really was something. He's just such a physically towering guy. So even on just a human level, I'm not short. I'm about 6 foot, and he stands well above me. And it was that kind of summed it up in a metaphorical way, how it did feel mixing with some of those people. But I think it was nice to get the exposure to that early. It was a huge privilege to be able to have that opportunity early on in my career, because it's meant that whilst I'm always in awe of people when I meet them in commentary boxes or in press boxes or whatever, you never quite get over that, I don't think. People always say they do, but I don't believe them. But when I met, I've met lots of cricketers, lots of people I had on my, pictures on my wall when I was a kid, and it does get easier, that sense of oh, hello, this is Shane Warne. I'm now going to talk to Shane Warne. I'm now going to talk to Adam Gilchrist. I'm now going to talk to these people, these giants of the game. And I've got to try and provide them with a service. I'm not just sat there fanboying about it. I'm trying to impart some of my knowledge, inverted commas, to them, to help them do their job. And so I think trying to get exposed to these people, these talented, wonderful people early on, it probably does take away a little bit of that nervousness, as you say, that cold feet, because I definitely was not cool as a cucumber the first time I did it, but I think you get better at it, and I think it becomes progressively more fun because you're relaxed. It's more like you're kind of at work, which is bizarre because you're mixing with your heroes, but it does become more like just kind of going to the office and just hanging out with incredibly interesting people. But it gets easier, and it was a privilege to be able to kind of start that journey quite early, I guess.
I hope Ian Bishop remembers your name.
Gosh, I certainly don't think he does. He knows Freddie quite well from the podcast. I very much hope, given how many mistakes I probably made in my first summer, I hope he doesn't. I want a second chance at a first impression.
So moving on, you spoke of working with the likes of Shane Warne, Adam Gilchrist, which probably, takes me to your experience with working with the Melbourne Stars in the BBL. Talk us through something about that. And what I also want to know is that with the kind of data that has come to light now, do you think players, coaches, and everyone in the team think tank setup has become more receptive towards, a particular kind of data, or do you still think that they rely on their instinct and their knowledge much more, or is it a combination of both?
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of both. Like, like anything in the game, there's always influences from different angles. I mean, at the Stars particularly, it's absolute dream. I love working with them, and I'm on coming up to my third season in this winter, and we've had a very good season in our first one, and then not a very good season in the following one subsequently. And that's the highs and lows of professional sport, I think. But one thing which I've been lucky to work with some very kind of engaged, intelligent coaches, with Dave Hussey and Clint Mackay in particular as the bowling coach. They've both been incredibly receptive to plans and to selection ideas and to just kind of shaking stuff up. But they're also, they're their own men. They've got their own views about the game, and they're not here to just kind of listen to whatever this kid on the other side of the world has got to say. They're more than happy to kind of engage with it and to pass ideas back and forth, and they'll ask questions and they'll engage with broader ideas about it. And sometimes it's about big things, about big ideas, about importance of left-hand right-hand partnerships, something as big and broad as that. Or it might be something as incredibly specific as who do we bowl to this batsman in this over, if they're this many wickets down, and what should they bowl? Should it be a googly? Should it be a leggy? Should it be above 90 kilometers per hour? Should it be below? Like, you can go as fine or as broad as you can, as you want, really. And I think that range is what makes it kind of easier for everyone in the game now to engage with data. To kind of answer the second part of the question, is I don't think there are a handful of people in the game who are absolute devotees of data, absolute kind of stone cold devotees. You could count them on one hand in the whole world. And then at the other end, there are probably a few more, but there are not very many absolute stone cold deniers of it who just don't care, don't want to know about it. In terms of T20 coaching particularly, I think most people exist in the middle on a bit of a spectrum, and young coaches particularly, I think, or coaches coming into the game in the last few years, I think it's just foolish to ignore it. Even if after a season or two, you've kind of been exposed to it and with your team, and then you decide it's not for me, I'm not that interested in it, or I'm not interested in this particular kind of data, I'm not interested in this kind of advice, I want to forward my own path. That kind of coaching journey, I think, makes sense, and I think that probably happens for quite a lot of people. But equally, I think there's a similar number of people who kind of start off like gently skeptical, but want to learn about it, and then end up being won round to it and end up kind of relying on it, not necessarily as a crutch, but as a key part of their pre-match preparations. This isn't new stuff. Going back decades, teams did research. It was just that the research was sending scouts. Now, instead of sending scouts, you send scouts and look at data. You send scouts, look at data, and ask players who played with them in different teams. You accumulate more information by using data than if you didn't. Whether or not you choose to place more importance on what your batting coach thought when he went to watch KKR last season, or what do you think, or how important is it that Owen Morgan played with Andre Russell at KKR this IPL, so his personal experience when it comes to England playing in the World Cup against the West Indies might carry more weight, but it will also be placed alongside the actual statistical information that is provided by the analysts within the setup. And it's going to fluctuate as to who's given more importance and who's given more respect, and it's going to fluctuate for all kinds of reasons. For sometimes that's going to be because the individuals involved are very prominent, powerful people. You've got guys like Shree at KKR, Nathan Lehman at England, and in the last few years, Multan Sultans and KKR as well. There's numerous high-profile analysts around the world now. Dean Hill's at Australia, and these guys carry different kinds of, they carry wins with them, they carry teams with them, they carry a lot of respect. Not everyone can be that. Sometimes you're just a skinny British kid rocking up and saying, "Hello, have you considered opening with Nathan Coulter-Nile?" and sometimes that's all it is. And you're just giving someone a nudge in a different direction. I think people often want to kind of have an opinion about data in sports and in cricket because it's of the moment, and they want to have a strong opinion either way, like it's the future or it's irrelevant and people should get out of our game. Whereas in reality, I think, it's just adding something to the equation. You're adding information, you're adding an opinion, you're adding a different kind of voice. And personally, obviously I would say that, but I think that's for the good of the game. I don't think it's possible for that kind of progression, for that kind of development of the game to be anything but a positive.